Hello, everyone. Welcome to the conversation with a practitioner series. Today, we have our wonderful guest, Janet Foutty, former chair and CEO of Deloitte Consulting and author of Thrive and Arrive. Welcome, Jen. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be here with you. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Jen. So, our students are all very curious as a chair and CEO of a big consulting multinational company. So tell us, what's the typical day of your life when back to the days of being a CEO and chair?
Well, the days aren't too far back, so it's a pretty clear memory. But I have to tell you that it's a classic "it depends" answer, and every day is very different. And if I had a typical day, it would be a mix of 3 or 4 things. So spending time with clients.
Yes.
So I spent the first half of my career living at clients every day. You know, when you were the CEO and chair, you can't do that, but I would have a conversation with a client or two. I would spend some time with my team on maybe some operations issues, things that are happening in the business. I would spend time with teams focusing on client strategy, and then maybe do a town hall with some of our people, some of our team. So in any given day, it's a whole mishmash of things, and it keeps me hopping. It keeps me having to be on top of my schedule.
Yeah.
One of the key things is, of course, finding moments to breathe in days that run back to back to back to back, from client to team to the board.
Yeah.
But so I wish I could tell you it was nice and neat and tidy, but it's a pretty broad set of things.
Of course.
In pre-pandemic, I would say now we're sort of back to close to pre-pandemic travel, which also means you're in 3 to 4 cities in any given week. The nice thing about being on the road is you get downtime to breathe when you're in transit.
Yeah. So we typically talk about for CEOs, the only one thing unchanged is actually the change itself.
Exactly. That's the one thing you can count on, is it's never going to be the same.
Right. So Jen, how many countries have you been to? That's a difficult question.
I did not think I would get a trick question here today. How many countries have I been to? I don't know, probably, 40, 50, something like that.
Wow.
No, well in the double digits.
Yes.
I would say I spent less time in South America, but a little bit of time in South America. Aside from that, I've sort of spent meaningful time in most of the major countries around the globe.
Right. So among all the countries you've been to, are there any moments you feel like, that's interesting, impressive, for some of the challenges, or, wonderful surprise? Any stories to share?
So I would say that, first of all, my travel tends to be pretty business-centric.
Sure.
As someone who is raising kids through much of my career, my goal was to sort of get out,
get
there,
the business
get in,
done,
and get out as quickly as possible, including
Sure.
some pretty crazy train and plane travel along the way. But I would say the countries in Asia are probably the ones that I have the strongest impressions, because it is so different. I obviously love spending time in Europe and love spending time in Latin America, but the culture is so different. So I'd have to say probably China and India are the 2 countries that have probably left the strongest impression on me in terms of sense of culture, sense of community, sense of innovation and change.
Yes.
So those 2 places, even though they couldn't be more different. They couldn't be more different. But those are probably the 2 countries that have left the strongest impression on me in my travels.
Yeah. So those are long distance travel as well.
I think
it's like really far.
Yes. I think my longest travel sort of direct is probably to South Africa, but I've spent time in Australia, and then obviously, and I spent a lot of time in India in particular. I'd be in India multiple times a year. So that's a long round trip both ways. Right.
I mean, for Deloitte Consulting, your client and your team, they are international in a sense because they choose you, right? And then 100%. But still, you might still see some subtle differences for your team, say in Asia, and the team back home in the US. What are some of the differences you see?
I think the differences probably transcend, are really rooted in the cultural differences in the geographies. You could meet a Deloitte consultant in India or China or the UK or Chicago, my home city.
Yeah.
And there's certain elements that are the same in terms of sort of how they think about business problems, their warmth, their collaboration.
Yes.
But there's such strong cultural differences between those countries that those certainly sort of bleed through all of those dimensions. And then how they think about the market, even though you think about clients and how sort of this client service mindset is consistent.
Yes.
But I think about the time I've spent in India and China both, and the market landscape is, even though they're multinational clients, is quite different in terms of how you build the depth of relationships.
Right.
How you sell can be very different. So it is, I would say the common sort of platform is the same, but there's lots of nuances in terms of both how our clients carry themselves and engage, and how our practitioners do as well.
Right. That's so interesting, because for consulting, everything is about problem solving, right? So you identify a problem and then you solve the problems.
A problem or an opportunity.
Oh, opportunity.
Yes.
Problem is not negative. Problem could be an untapped opportunity.
Exactly.
Or it could be a threat, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So do you see like different patterns of different problems or different opportunities across different regions?
You know, I think in true growth markets, I think that the opportunities look quite different. So I spent a lot of time in India as the economy and the tech economy was really flourishing.
Yes.
And so very different than spending time in Silicon Valley, where sort of the culture of innovation and the culture of tech was very established. So quite different there.
Right.
So I would say it's more where they are in the cycle of maturity in an industry or a market. Probably more than sort of a geographic difference.
Sure.
Maybe I'll just share a quick funny story that just sort of came into my brain from spending time in China, which I've loved spending time in China over the years, and unfortunately have not been since the pandemic. But I grew up on Wall Street, and that's where my client base was, and there's certainly a style of doing business on Wall Street.
Sure.
I then spent time in state government in the U.S. I spent time in the federal government in the U.S. in healthcare. So I get to China for my first big meeting, and despite all those differences in types of clients and environments that I've seen, from Wall Street to the government is pretty different. I get to China to my first meeting, and I was probably not quite as well prepped as I could have been, because it was a very formal meeting. So I walk in and everyone has a place card and a very clear agenda.
Sure.
And it was super clear what we were supposed to talk about and what we were not supposed to talk about. I'm used to Wall Street, a much more free form and free-flowing conversation, even in the government. And I had to sit up a little straighter, and I had a translator in my ear, even though my clients spoke some English, they clearly preferred to do business in Chinese. And there were, in the U.S., we're so focused on, really clearly, here's the 7 outcomes and here's all the next steps. The formality in China, the outcome, the outcomes were there, but it was not nearly as transparent to my Western eyes and ears as it was to my Chinese colleagues. So that was very much very eye-opening in terms of not just the things that you sort of read about and think about in terms of cultures and customs, but a very different moment for me.
Right. Yeah. So unless you be there in person, and then you
never could have imagined
that subtle atmosphere, right? Yeah. So when you were there, you were literally like living the culture. You will feel like, you have to be a little bit more serious. I mean, people don't make jokes a lot.
Clearly not. No small talk.
No small talks. No jokes. Yeah, you see the clear hierarchy, power.
And where you sit, you can't move. I would be like, I think these two people should switch seats. Yeah, no.
Yeah, we have a rule for seat. Like the most respectful guest, I think you will sit the one facing the door.
Facing the door.
Facing the door, because you can see whenever things like dangerous happen, you can.
Which I actually like facing the door anyway, so I was very happy about that. But I didn't. Yeah, so that was though I worked in many cultures and many environments, that's probably the one where I was the most. I had to sort of reset my brain in that very first meeting.
Right. What about food? Did you enjoy any good Chinese food while you were there?
So I grew up in Washington, D.C., which has
a lot of international
really
cuisines.
And a lot of good Chinese food. I've got both of my children are in long-term relationships with people from China. So I have a good, not perfectly
cultural immersion about China.
Chinese palate, but I definitely love the food. When I travel, usually I sort of eat around the edges of meetings and don't pay, but in China, I was paying very close attention to making sure I got meals.
Yeah. Peking ducks?
Peking duck. Lots of dumplings.
A lot of dumplings.
Made me very happy.
That was awesome.
I didn't know we were going to talk about China so much today. I love that.
I mean, China is so big, right? So today when we talk in my class, when I talk about international business, just occasionally, even though we are not talking about China, we talk about Latin America, and then we talk about supply chain. Boom, they're a supplier in China,
yes.
or the big customer in China. So because China is so big and China is so different, right? So that, and so different from the US, two big superpower, so that and China is big. So many people. We say that 1/5 of the entire population there is actually Chinese.
Hard for us in the U.S. where we can be so think that we're the center of the universe, right? To get exposed to that. So it's amazing your students are getting to get a little flavor of that.
Right. So speaking of that, so if you're going to give some advice to my students who study international business, right? So what would you say? Why studying international business, or more broadly, have a global mindset is going to be help them in the career? So what would you say?
Yeah, so I would say two things. One, I would say is sort of an evergreen truth back from when I was a student here was true, is that the likelihood that your organization or your clients that you serve are going to be internationally relevant is very high. There's a very narrow parts of the market, parts of healthcare that aren't international, obviously serving domestic governments aren't, but aside from that, pretty much every organization is going to have a lens of outside of our country, for those of you who are based in the U.S., as part of your portfolio.
Yeah.
And so understanding both culture, as we were talking about, and trends, but also what the business environment is like, where they are on the maturity curve, so important. Have a good frame of reference there.
Right.
The thing that I think is become much more understood currently is the importance of understanding how to work with very diverse teams, with very diverse people. And I sort of well studied and understood today that the more diverse the team, the more diverse the backgrounds, the more diverse the learning styles, the better outcome you have. And so I think it's incredibly important to understand markets, but I think it's also incredibly important to understand how to work with people who come from very different backgrounds and perspectives than you do. And I certainly have found that the broadest teams that I have with people from the most diverse backgrounds, including people who were not born and raised in the U.S. Or in Western cultures, makes the outcomes so much stronger and so much better. So I think it's both the content side as well as the cultural and team side.
That's so interesting. I definitely, though what all you shared was, I feel very, very well connected, because research show that for a team, if you have the optimum creativity, you actually have a different team. You don't want to have a homogeneous team. So that one of that, cultural background is actually one of the good element can add to diverse perspective, which ultimately produce innovation.
100% exactly right. So I think it's not just the organizations, but it could be, you could be working on something that was entirely domestic, but still have a very global team with people who've grown up in different cultures and carry different values and the way they think about the universe.
Yes. So what is also interesting, you mentioned earlier about the different life cycles, right? So in emerging countries, let's say China, India, many South Africa countries and Latin America countries, right? So you will see it's booming, it's growing faster, right? But in other markets, like in Europe, so they are at different cycles, so they are looking more for sustainability, a little bit more long-term. They already surpassed the rapid growth, so they are looking at a broader stakeholder perspective, right? So so I was maybe pick your brain a little bit more on those, right? So on the one hand, we see globally, we see more like a convergent. So particularly all the global cities you go to Seoul, you go to Hong Kong, you go to Shanghai, for instance, you probably feel like, it's almost like in New York, Chicago in some sense. But meanwhile, we also see there are still fundamental differences in all those countries. And today, with a lot of the challenges, political, ideological, right? So I guess the question to you is, how do we, business leaders, business students, how do we like navigate the complexity of international business for simultaneous convergence, but also divergence? That's a big question, I know.
That is a big question. And I guess my simple answer to that would be, it is all about how you build your teams. And building your teams, which I know is a simplistic way to look at it, but I don't think there's any of us who are all-knowing about everything that is happening in each of those markets and each of those cycles and and obviously very industry specific as well. So to me, it actually gets back to this idea of how you build a team with the depth and breadth of experience and expertise that can help you navigate all those things. Clearly, and that's both people who were born and raised in other countries, who've done assignments in other countries. You know, I did not have the privilege, which I wish I had, of doing a true expat assignment in a geography, though I've spent enormous amounts of time in India in particular. And so I feel like I got a pretty good sense of how to navigate the business cycles and doing business in India, but I know that it is different than someone who either was born and raised there or who was deployed there on a long-term assignment and really, really understands how to get business done. So
I think you're being humbling. So maybe that's brought us to the next question about leadership. So obviously we don't have like uniform profile for leaders, right? Or managers. So do you, based on your own experience and interaction with people across different cities, across different countries, do you see some of the shared traits of leaders, or what are the things, maybe something different?
I love that question. I want to focus on the universal truths because I think they're really important. And the things that I look at, which are not always as easy to see cross-culturally as they are in the U.S., are the things I think that define great leaders, which is humility, which is acknowledging that you don't know what you don't know in a way that's appropriate for your level. I think it is curiosity and interest and willingness to learn. I think it is leaders who are willing to build a diverse team, not all of people who look, walk, and talk like them. And so I think those things, I think those that are willing to take risks and are not afraid of failure, which can look very different cross-culturally. So I think getting at each of those things, which is, if I was building an entirely domestic team or a global team, are the things that would be the universal truths that I would look for. As sort of fundamental. And it might look very different in someone who's from a different background. And I think about people I've worked with from various parts of Europe who, on the directness front, are absolutely way more direct than I would be in the U.S. So I have to sort of always gauge in that. But when you think about building diverse teams, it's something that some of my colleagues have had less experience doing. And so, but I sort of look to an openness to that as something that I look for and push on in building teams that are cross-cultural and just outside of one domestic market.
I think that's so helpful. So, but speaking of female leadership, I know, congratulations on the book, Thrive and Arrive. Female leadership is also something near and dear to my heart as well. So speaking of female leadership, do you see like any differences between the styles of female leaders and versus male leaders?
So that's I actually would maybe pivot that discussion a little bit to just talk about how different cultures' expectations of women and women in business are so different. And I've come to appreciate, when I started working globally, and I do talk a lot about women and women in leadership, so even if I was in a country to talk about a client, I'd like to sit down with the women clients, with the women in that community. And I've come to appreciate how important the societal conversation is in terms of how women show up and the expectations of women, both as leaders and earlier in their career. And so that has been something that I spent a lot of time thinking about and learning. I do think there are also universal truths for women in terms of the challenges. And I certainly in the U.S. we have made tremendous progress around women and their role in the business community, in government. But there's still some things that are really hard. And they are societal. And innate. I mean, the few things that I think are incredibly consistent, one and the most obvious is women's expectations around their role in family. And that certainly is, there's a baseline of that around the world in terms of being mothers. But I spent time in countries where expectations for how you care for your broader family is very different.
Yes.
I have responsibility for my children in the US.
Yes.
And in the long run, I have responsibility for my parents, but that is not in the same years when I am raising my children. So it's quite different here than it is in some countries in Asia, for example. So the family responsibilities are a universal truth for sure. The second thing that I think is a universal truth is sponsorship. So, we've been talking about women for a really long time in the U.S. and in the workforce.
Yeah.
And I would say we've had uneven progress.
Right.
And I do believe we finally understand that sponsorship is one of the reasons that we've had such uneven progress. Sponsorship meaning I'm going to use my political capital to help you, right? Not mentorship. Mentorship, you and I have a great conversation. We both learn a little bit and we go our separate ways. Sponsorship means I use the capital that I've earned to help you. The natural inclination, and I think this is true across all societies, that might be a little bit, you can challenge me on that as the expert, is that we tend to sponsor people that are similar to us.
Sure.
That come from the same backgrounds, that went to the same schools, that are the same gender, that are the same race.
Yes.
And so we have to be much more deliberate around using our political capital to help people that don't look like us.
Right.
So that is, I believe, also a universal truth that transcends geography and culture.
Right.
Is that we have to figure out how to sort of break that cycle of sponsorship and helping and supporting and using our hard-earned capital to help women.
Yes.
All of us have a responsibility to do that. So those are two things off the top of my head that I think are consistent around the globe.
Yes.
That we have to, there's obviously big nuances, but I think we have to get underneath each of those within the country or geography that we're in to change the conversation for women.
Yeah. Oh, I love this. I think the sponsorship, what you observed, was absolutely correct. So it's like emphasizing perspective taking. So it's easier to emphasizing and perspective taking when you have personally experienced similar experience. You can more feel relate. You know what to help, how to help.
I think that's very much human nature. Is that most people are comfortable with people that are like them.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And so we have to push and challenge that, I think, from a business leader perspective to understand that sponsorship is what really matters. And we have to help people get more comfortable in sponsoring people that are not exactly like them.
Exactly. Yeah, we have research shows, we study CEOs of S&P 500 companies. We find that all the male CEOs, once they have a daughter, when they're born, have a daughter born, so they started to become more empathetic. So they started to have more employee benefits, and then you can see those are the life-changing moments.
And it's funny because a lot of men I hear say that, I have a daughter, and so now, and so I try to resist the temptation to say, I really wish you had cared about this before you had a daughter.
Exactly.
But I'll take it. If that's what changed your mindset, then that is a wonderful thing, and that benefits everyone. Including your daughter.
Exactly. Yeah, this morning actually I was listening to a podcast talking about the women talents in the U.S. So they talk about this from HBR podcast. So they talk about 4/5 of the talents in their fresh graduate female. So they would say, I want to get promoted. So they want to, go to a better role. And then 2/3 of them, they say they want to go all the way to up. And then eventually, in their late 30s and 40s, we lost many of those. I mean, I observe in my class, for the undergraduate class, we have so many talented young women. Incredible. And then for graduate school, the same, somehow down the road, right? So we, for various reasons. So if you were giving young female, students, and then the ones who freshly graduated, give them a couple of tips, right? So, because looking at you, if you don't do anything, just looking at you succeed is like good role modeling for them to, it's for them to watch, see, hey, Jen did it, maybe we can do it, right? So if you're going to give them some, tips, what would you say?
So the couple things I would say. One is you can start practicing here at school, which is really focusing on your communication skills. And by the way, this is true for men and women. I think a huge differentiator for moving through the executive ranks is both your written and verbal communication skills.
Sure.
Practice, 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 practice. Something that's maybe more specific for women is working on building your confidence in talking about yourself. And by the way, this is true cross-cultural. I've spent a lot of time with women around the globe on this topic. We know, and it's been well studied, and with all due respect and love for our male colleagues, that women tend to undersell themselves and men tend to oversell themselves.
Sure.
So if there's a job that has 10 criteria, if a woman doesn't check all 10 of those boxes, I'm not ready yet.
Yeah.
Whereas a man might not check quite all 10 of those boxes and with confidence say, yep, I'm ready for that role. So starting to work on how do you talk about yourself and how do you talk about your accomplishments in a way that's really comfortable and natural to you. Because women say, I don't want to brag, I don't want to self-promote.
Sure.
And finding people that you can practice that with, and that sounds really funny to practice talking about yourself, but find other men and women that you can say, here's how I'm going to talk about myself in the next recruiter I meet or the next boss I meet. And have people challenge you. Are you being positive enough about your accomplishments? And so getting good at that through practice is something I think is really important. And then maybe the third thing I would say is to know that I think many women in particular, but men and women, want to have their life all planned out. Here's what's going to happen to me professionally. Here's what's going to happen to me personally. And if you have that all planned out, more power to you, but to get comfortable that there's going to be twists and turns along the way. But that it will all still be okay. So things in your family, things in your professional life are not going to go according to this nicely mapped plan. And that is something that you should get comfortable with, because the likelihood that it's all going to unfold exactly the way you think it is as a high-performing student is not necessarily the case. And I'm certainly absolutely an example of that. I've started talking a lot more about my setbacks along the way, personal and professional, to remind you that you just don't go from A to B in a nice, neat, linear manner.
Sure. Yeah, I love that. So it's like practicing communication, verbal and written. That's so important. And then second is actually embrace uncertainty and then be ready to pivot all the time.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's so interesting.
And then practice talking about yourself.
Talking. Yeah, practice
about
talking
yourself,
about yourself.
which is hard. No one likes it.
Yes. Research actually shows, we study female and male. We find that female, they don't negotiate for salary. So this is this is why we see the persistence of pay gap. We use professor as a sample. It's easier because professors relatively, you would consider it's more pay equality because it's a setting that relatively you have a more homogeneous metrics to measure performance. But still, we see the gap. Yeah.
Well, that's why here in the U.S. And in the U.K., I do not know around the world, you probably know better than I do, that many companies, well, first of all, there's a lot more transparency in reporting, which is a good thing. The second thing is many companies have stopped asking for prior salaries when people move jobs. Because what happens is when people move jobs every 2 to 5 years, women tend to fall further behind. And then it just ends up being this compounding effect as you move job to job. So many organizations have stopped asking for prior salary history in order not to compound that effect for women.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's so true. Because women, they might have a lot of constraint internally and externally for job hopping. And then their base just stay there. Yeah. So that's a great
practice is organizations that don't ask for prior salary history. Because the natural thing is you get a 5 to 10% increase when you switch jobs. So if you report your prior salary history, it just compounds on itself.
So
I did not know we were going to go there today to talk about pay equity. It's a super important topic.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you 2 interesting questions. So one, if you can time travel, what would you say or what would you do differently in your early 20s?
So maybe 2 things. One I hinted at, which is I would have taken an expat assignment somewhere along the course of my career. And it was complicated for family reasons, but I would have figured out how to make that much more, I think it would have been great for me and great for my family. The second thing is a bit closer to home is I was the type of person where my investment in what I was doing was very focused on the here and now, including in relationships. So I'll just use when I started a young family, the only things I was focused on were my current client and my team serving that client and my children. Pretty much everything else in the universe I blocked out to focus on those 2 things. And that it wasn't just when I was a young parent, right? I was very much a here and now person. And I would say that I probably let my relationships outside the here and now atrophy for many years. So I wasn't great at keeping connected to my business school friends. You know, even if I'd been on an assignment a year ago, I was not as disciplined about keeping those relationships, both personal and professional, strong, because I was very focused on the here and now. I've spent a lot of time recently focused on sort of making up for that, because I realized that I'd underinvested there, but being very deliberate about keeping my relationships fresh and current over the decades, as opposed to only focus tunnel vision on the thing that was in front of me.
But that is also very important, though, because every time everyone have limited, time and attention. I'm like that. So, because I need to focus on my career, and then I got 2 young kids I need to take care of, right? So those will have to be the priority at the time.
What I found is, because I was overwhelmed by that, so I did the same thing. What I found is you can do really little things to make a difference. So I travel a lot. So I try to just set 15 to 30 minutes of every flight that I'm on to think about who are 5 to 10 people that I don't feel as connected to, and I drop them a quick note.
That's a great exercise.
You'd be shocked at how many people. Just a quick note. I'm a little embarrassed we haven't talked in a while. I'd love to hear how you're doing, or someone.
I love that.
Or here's something I've just read that made me think of you, or that I've just listened to that made me think of you. I hope you're well. Drop me a note when you can on what you're working on, and next time we're in a similar city, let's grab a quick coffee. I continue to be shocked at how well people respond to that kind of communication. Because, by the way, if you haven't stayed connected to them, it's likely they haven't stayed connected to you either.
Right.
So it's a shared responsibility.
Right.
So I try to carve out time on every trip to do that. And so people have to figure out what works for them and what they're comfortable with.
Right.
And it could be, that you take an hour and you say, I'm going to call 2 people that I've been disconnected from when I'm taking a long walk. But there's, I think, little ways. So I wish I had invested more then. I know many people are much better at it than I am. I feel like this generation with social media helps a lot. But I've been trying to be more focused on that in the later parts of my career and life than I was earlier, and wished I had done more earlier.
Oh, I'm going to do that right away after our talk today.
Okay. I'm going to look for, in a few months, I'm going to look for a note from you.
Okay.
Janet, I was thinking about something we talked about.
Exactly.
And I talked about it in this class.
Exactly. Speaking of network relationship management, so one advantage, as we talked about, we have social media. We have so many platforms for us to get connected. On the other hand, relationship management, networking, it could be time and energy consuming, right? So particularly for the younger generation, I heard, my kids are still young, but I heard from my colleague how the teenagers are like so obsessed with the phone, messaging all the time. And then for college, for my undergraduate students, I see they are so busy every night with all these clubs and all the things. Nobody wants to be left behind, that's how they say, right? So I mean, it's a different world now. So how do we leverage the best of technology, but meanwhile still have some sort of dedication and no focused, tunnel if they can find their own tunnel?
So for me, first of all, I think that question is very personal, and people have to figure out what it means for them. For me, I've been pretty disciplined around, when my kids were smaller, my phone was in my bag until they went to bed. My phone was in my bag until they went to bed, full stop. I'd get home in the early evening, they'd be up for a couple of hours, and there was really nothing that was going to happen in the universe that would matter in those couple of hours. Obviously, they're in their 20s, so we're sort of not living and breathing together every day. Sort of a parallel example for now is around fitness. And fitness is something that I think I love, that as I've been spending time with students on campus, everyone understands how important it is to get enough sleep and to spend enough time doing the things that give you energy that are physical. So for me, I found I used to be someone who did fitness in the evening. That was, my evenings are consumed by dinners and clients, and so I made myself an early morning person, which I'm not by nature. And my phone, well, except for texts from my children. When I roll out of bed, I look for texts from my children. If I don't have any, great, or not great, depending on how, but it's good if there's no problems with my kids. I roll out of bed, I get dressed, I do something physical. So this morning I did a quick run in the gym in Bloomington.
Wow.
Because it's a little rainy outside. and I don't look at anything else on my phone until I'm out of the shower.
Yeah.
So I get up, I get dressed, I exercise,
Yeah.
I shower, and then I check the news, I check my emails, I check my text messages, and I'm a good probably 15 years into that through all sorts of different jobs and all sorts of different roles.
Yes.
And my mindset is that if I get into my phone and I start looking at what's happening, either what's important to me, which is a quick bout of physical exercise, it just doesn't happen at all because I get consumed. I go, oh, I need to call this person, and the hour disappears, or I start worrying about it all.
Yes.
And so it's just that time to not worry about the universe for another 45 minutes.
Yes.
And people are like, well, how do you do that? The stress, I go, I just pretend I'm on the West Coast. If I was on the West Coast, I'd still be sleeping. No one would know. People don't know what time zone I'm in anyway. Right. So that is so for me, so I think everyone has to figure out what are the places that they can focus on themselves and the people that are important in their universe where they're not distracted by whatever is distracting to you.
Yeah. I think discipline might add to another shared trait of those successful leaders. And this also going back to our very first question about your daily routine. I think this is almost like your daily routine, like mentally, physically, and then also professionally. Seems like you always have a routine. You're always like trying to do something similar, but also challenging,
within
learning
all the
things.
Chaos. You try to have a routine.
Right.
So for me, for sure, it is that morning routine.
Yes.
And it is, I really try to get to bed at a decent hour. And if I have to cut off the last 30 minutes of whatever is happening at the end of the day, I get to the point where I just try to unplug.
Yeah.
I read for 15 minutes and go to sleep. So within those boundaries, it could be a million different things, but those are boundaries that are really important for me, and I'm pretty disciplined about keeping those set.
I love that set of boundaries. And of course, different people have different boundaries.
Yes, exactly.
You need to find your boundaries.
It's very personal. It's very personal, right?
Yeah.
I work very closely with an executive who said 8 p.m. And so if we had a dinner that started at 7, he'd say, doesn't matter, I'm leaving at 8.
Yeah.
And he was willing to give up whatever relationship conversation would happen after 8.
Yeah.
And his day was done at 8 p.m.
Yeah.
So people have to figure out where what works for them.
Right.
So.
Yeah. So that also brought up to what we talked about earlier, say, as a team, right? We might have different boundaries, but meanwhile, probably open communication, transparency, and then figure out a way to work together, particularly today.
I think the best leaders today are able to create that kind of conversation amongst their teams.
Yeah.
And create the flexibility and predictability that their people need.
Yeah. Jen, what's your hobby? What do you do for fun?
Great question. So I love spending time with my family, as you can probably tell.
Yeah.
I love doing things outdoors. So I spend a lot of time outdoors, hiking, biking, skiing.
Yeah.
So that's really important to me. I love entertaining.
Yeah.
And entertaining in not a big, super fancy way, but I just love having a group of friends over for dinner and spending the evening, cooking with them and chatting and drinking wine. So those are all things that I love doing. They give me great energy.
Yeah, exactly. Give you the energy and then keep you refreshed and then keep going.
Exactly.
So what's next for you? What are some of the big things?
So I left Deloitte after 30 plus years, which was a big moment for me. And I've got a lot of really interesting things going on. I have not figured out, if and what I'm going to do full time. I've got some interesting things I'm exploring that are adjacent to the things I've done historically, but I don't want to just do the same thing again. In the meantime, it's amazing to do things like be here on campus.
Yeah.
I'm spending some time helping some small companies think about their growth. I'm spending some time helping the government think about U.S. competitiveness and U.S. and allies competitiveness. So I've got a whole broad set of things that I'm doing that are keeping me entertained and busy and fresh.
Oh, a lot of possibilities. Maybe we'll have you back again next time and then share what you had for the next journey.
Well, it was so lovely to get to spend time in this very wide-ranging conversation with you.
We had a lot of conversation. Thank you so much, Jen. Thank you.
Thank you very much.